Welcome back to the archive again, Philip, and I'm pumped for this one. I am pumped for all the interviews we do, but I'm really excited because we're going to talk today about the spiritualism movement.
A very unique, again, another very uniquely American invention. We keep talking about all these wonderful subjects that we find out are very uniquely American in their origin.
Yeah, Christmas, that's all American,
Valentine's Day,
all American.
all American.
And they say Americans can't be romantic.
That's right. Well, and they also say Americans have no culture, but dead wrong.
Dead wrong, dead wrong. Uh,
As dead as the dead, the
It's
spirits.
the spirits. So, spiritualism contains a lot of talk about spirits of all things. So let's get started with how or and when this whole thing kicked off.
Well, in the 19th century, there was it started kind of in there's where spiritualism itself started, but there's also the origin of the ideas behind spiritualism. Now, historians place it going back to Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a he was a writer, he was a philosopher, he was a mystic, and he was an inventor. And he invented lots of practical things, but he also wrote about Christianity and theology. And he, one day in his life, suddenly at dinner, suddenly saw a man in the corner looking at him, and this guy like followed him home. And later at his home, he introduced himself basically as God, and God is now speaking to Emanuel Swedenborg, the inventor, and saying he has a new revelation to impart to the world through him. And part of this, so he starts having visions of the afterlife, of angels, of God, of Jesus. And it's totally different from what mainstream Christianity had taught about the afterlife. And what he was being shown was that the world of the spirits is not like heaven with the pearly gates and streets of gold and harps and angels, and hell with being poked with, being tortured by demons, and the lake of fire. It wasn't that. To him, there was a series of heavens and a series of hells, and there was a whole, just another universe that spirits lived in, and they could communicate with you. And this was very, very, very different. And they could communicate. That the big thing was that they could communicate with the living. Um, that's one of the main figures. The other was the founder of mesmerism, uh, and his name was Franz Mesmer. And we're talking. This is like the 1700s we're talking about. So this is around the time of French and Indian War, American Revolution. This is where these ideas originated before they could influence the 1800s. So Franz Mesmer would he created mesmerism, where he would hypnotize people and people would go into trances, and sometimes they would claim to be communicating with otherworldly beings. Again, this is very different to how people were taught about the metaphysical nature of our universe in Europe, which was very Christian, which is very it was either Catholic or it was Protestant, but neither Catholicism nor Protestantism officially taught any of these things. This kind of stuff was actually closer to witchcraft. Necromancy doesn't mean doing black magic. Necromancy means raising the dead so you can speak to them, so they can either give you, and this was considered like kind of witchcraft at the time, but it existed in this kind of gray area. This is after the Middle Ages. This is after the high period of the witch trials and the Inquisition. And interestingly enough, this was also the period of the Enlightenment. This was a period of increased belief in rationality and science and order, and that there must be a rational physical explanation for everything. At the same time, you had this growing movement of believing that you could comprehend the universe and the afterlife by directly communicating with the disembodied spirits that had crossed over. And so in this, so these two men popularized this idea in the 1700s, and then um, in the 1800s was when spiritualism really began, and it was a part of the same mindset, and it started in upstate New York, which is where a lot of religious movements in the 1800s started. It's technically where Mormonism started, and it's where Seventh Day Adventism
Okay,
started.
so Emmanuel kicks it off. He thinks he sees God, or is claiming he sees God in his visions. Mesmerism comes on, and he introduces that. Just very quickly on mesmerism and its inventions. Was that scientific? Was that medical? Was that mysticism in nature? The origins of or the creation of that?
Um, it's kind of hard to say. It's The belief was that there was something supernatural you could get out of it, certainly.
From
And
its
now we
from
and
its
now we
conception.
from its inception there was there's this idea that you can induce a state in someone else through you know through putting them in a trance, through repetition of certain things. Um, of course, nowadays you would say there's also a social component to it. When you talk about people having to, you have to kind of want to be hypnotized. It takes something on the part of the participant. So there's a social element too.
Yeah, so
Uh,
there's an interest in seeing something.
yeah, and it was considered. I think it was considered on the border. Like there was a little bit of science to it. There were people saying, "Wow, this man is dangerous.
Mhm.
This man has power over people." Um, I wouldn't, but they weren't looking at him like he was a wizard or a sorcerer. He wasn't casting a spell on them, but he was manipulating physical things to induce a state.
Okay.
So it was on the border of, I would say it was on the border of science and the
And
supernatural.
okay, and was he as an individual, was he on the border of science and mysticism? Was he a scientific person? Was he a mystic person?
I think he saw himself as having discovered something, as discovered a an element of the human experience. Because this was also the time when like electricity was starting to be harnessed by people, and like I forgot what his name was,
Thomas
but
Edison.
not Thomas Edison. This was the far far earlier, um, closer to the age of Mesmer. But he was actually what inspired Frankenstein, because what he would do is he would go around with a little electric currents, and his name escapes me, but I remember I did some research about him years ago. But yes, but this idea that this was science, but it could be used, but who knows how far it could go? Because also to these people, this was not a, this was still a period where it wasn't necessarily you believed in science and atheism, or you believed in mysticism and Christianity. This was a time when the greatest scientists said, "Yeah," and Jesus spoke to me and told me to, like this was a period where science wasn't purely materialistic.
Separated. It
Yeah,
was separated
like
from.
up through this period, people were looking at science as a way to discover God's creation. This was a way to unveil the mysteries that are ultimately supernatural in origin. This was because in the 19th century, that's when evolution theory of evolution was first devised. When people started like looking at geology in terms of like, maybe the Earth isn't only 5,000. Maybe the Earth is more than 6,000 years old. Maybe the world is actually millions of years or more. What does that mean? What does that mean to us? But they didn't look at it like, wow, this disproves everything we thought about God and Jesus and Christianity. This just said, wow, look at the brilliant, beautiful mysteries that God has given us. So when you're talking about someone who is scientific, it doesn't mean that there isn't a supernatural, mystical component with it.
Okay. All right. That is really what all my questions were kind of aiming for was this is the beginning where science starts to become something separated uh, from religion, from spirituality.
Yeah, because at this point, science really had only been around for since probably the 1500s. What we know as modern science had only been around
Yeah.
since that the supernatural was acting in the world that we are in, that it surrounds us, and that the devil, the devil could be anywhere at any time, waiting to pounce and steal your soul. At the time, but at the same time, they were trying to order the universe and order their world around them and predict things and understand why things work and how they work. Um, yeah, so it was certainly it took a long time for science to it took a long time for people to separate religion from science and to separate the mystical from science. Going back to Plato, I mean, people would say that Plato is kind of like the origin of philosophy itself, and his whole thing was that there's a mystical connection between everything from the planets to the musical scales to the and that everything is connected in a supernatural way, but we should figure out how those things how everything is affected by each other and find out the origins of things and to find out how we can understand things better. And that's the origin of science ultimately.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Nail
that
on
was
the
as
head right there.
and he was as mystical as yeah, and it was a religion. It was a cult. We should do a thing on Plato as well. That the original hippie commune uh,
Yeah.
turns out it's the beginning of all Western science.
Anyway, so getting back so Emmanuel kicks off spiritualism. Um, and so he's apparently talking to God. Apparently, afterwards, you can mesmerize people, and people can become capable of connecting with the dead and God and Jesus and all this other stuff, and have all
It
these,
popularized it exactly. Yeah.
yeah, popular visions. Was this an immediate thing? Was this a gradual thing? Was it something that was there until he had one particular case and then it blew up?
It really, well, going back to upstate New York. So, upstate New York in the United States at the time was was like the frontier. It because of the in the early 1800s, America was you know half of what it is today, and so beyond that was Louisiana Purchase territory. It was Indian territory. It was the region of trappers and bears, and it was the wilds. And so if you lived in upstate New York, you were basically on the verge of civilization, and there were not as many clergy out there. So people left to their own devices had developed kind of their own religious beliefs, and that's where you got Joseph Smith with Mormonism. That's where you got the Millerites, who uh, started when when a man believed that he predicted when the second coming of Christ would happen, and that it would happen on October 22nd, 1844. And when it didn't happen, everybody had to come up with a reason of why it failed, or did it actually happen secretly and we just don't know about it? Is it more of a symbol? And that gave rise to the modern day Seventh Day Adventist movement. So this is a place of unique religions that are coming up, and unorthodox approaches to the supernatural and to the metaphysical. And here is where the Fox sisters come into play. They were a group of sisters who lived in New York, and they believed, or they claimed, that there was a spirit in their house of a peddler who had died there years before, and they could talk to him. They couldn't really talk to him. They could communicate with him because when they would ask him to rap on the walls with his ghostly knuckles, he would. And they did this in front of other people, and people went, "Oh, they're communicating with a ghost, and he's really doing it. I can hear it for myself."
Uh-huh.
This isn't like going to church where a preacher is telling you or a priest is telling you about what God and the supernatural are doing. This is directly experiencing the supernatural right here, right now. You can hear it with your own ears. And people went nuts for this. They were like, this is amazing. We want to see more. Can you do it again? What more can you do? Other people got influenced by the Fox sisters, and they started having their own what they called seances. And this is where seances were came about. And now it started to spread everywhere. You had all these Americans hearing about these seances being conducted, and ghosts are rapping on. You can hear a real ghost communicate with you. Wow. And not only that, sometimes they're starting to lift things. They're lifting the table. They're producing a mystical supernatural substance called ectoplasm. Oh my goodness, this changes everything. This is not what I thought the world was. This is blowing my mind as a 19th century American. And it took off, spread like wildfire. Now you've got people inspired, and they want to go further because these are paying audiences. You're making money from this. These are paying audiences coming to see you talk with the dead. And are the dead going to write? Are they going to control your fingers as you write on a piece of paper and write messages? Your father died and you're worried about him, but you don't have to worry anymore because he just talked to you last night and he told you that he's okay. This is big.
So, what were some of these ways that people were communicating with the dead aside from mesmerizing? What were things that people now were getting into?
Well, it wasn't so much mesmerizing at this point. At this point, it was people acting as a medium. And as we know, the dictionary definition of a medium is something that through which something else happens. So if so, a medium is
So you're the psychic middleman.
a middleman, exactly. Yes, absolutely. You are the telephone, they are the listener, and the ghost is talking on the other end. And so without and so also you're very important. Think about that. So uh, you are requesting that it knock a couple times, twice for yes, once for no, or whatever. They would have trumpet blowing. So blow on the trumpet if you are really here, and people will go, "Oh, how is the trumpet making a sound if no one's? I don't see anybody's lips on it. How is it happening?" Uh, Ectoplasm. What is this gooey, weird substance? It must be supernatural in origin. Uh, and then when photography took off, then there were supposed pictures of ghosts. There were pictures of the people in the room and the thing that they didn't see in the room, and it's now it's and but it was right behind me. Spooky.
I think
This
I have
it was physical evidence. The idea was that it was things you could hear and see of the supernatural.
I have a famous one right here on this one book.
Oh, see, and a lot of people really they felt they well, I say I'm spoiling it. They're saying they fell for it because the beginning of spiritualism was filled with enthusiasm, but it very quickly made a lot of people skeptical, and they wanted to find out what was really going on. Yeah, so it was so and automatic writing, as we say, the medium just starts writing, and then it takes on the form of words, and that's the ghosts making your hand, and so that's part of it. Uh, yeah, any number. There was lots of different ways that mediums conducting seances would demonstrate their powers, demonstrate the communication of the spirits to people. Very popular, especially after major wars. Because think about, the American Civil War, over 600,000 people, soldiers killed. And that's a lot of people. That's a lot of families with dead sons, dead brothers, dead fathers, dead cousins, and they want to see if they're okay. And now you have good news. You can talk to them, and that'll make you feel better. Like massive, and that reassurance helps them deal with their grief. So, so especially after major wars like Civil War or World War One, spiritualism really had surges in popularity.
Aside from the channeling and the psychic communication, what were, I mean, these things and these seances were so popular. I mean, I heard at one point Mary Todd Lincoln held a seance in the White House.
Yes, it was very, very popular. Yeah, Mary Todd Lincoln held a seance in the White House. It had supporters from mainly the middle class and the upper class. It was a thing. You would have a person. It could be like a party. It was a social gathering. We could have seances. I'm gonna have a seance at my house on Saturday. Everybody's invited. After dinner, after our servants and prepare and cook us dinner. It could be a social event, but
After
it
we've
was
had a
also
couple, after we've had a couple glasses of wine, we'll have a seance.
exactly, or brandy, yeah. Yeah, Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a huge proponent of spiritualism. He truly believed in it, and he was a part of something called the Ghost Society in England, which was uh, had a couple of other notable personages at the time, where they would basically investigate and prove or disprove supernatural phenomena, which sounds like a great TV show.
That does.
Victorian Ghost Hunters, starring Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh my God. The horrible sexist remarks. I could hear these
Oh yeah,
kids say now.
yeah, yeah. No, that'd have to be terrible. Um, but it's actually interesting that you bring up sex, because the spiritualism movement was a very female-dominated movement, uh, which is really unique, in the history of religion, especially at the time. Women in America, they couldn't really go to college. There were really not many women's colleges around. Women rarely held employment. Women couldn't open a bank account, and women couldn't vote. This was not a time when women had much power in society, but they were at the forefront and at the top of the spiritualism movement. Most major spiritualists, most major mediums were women. And even today, if I say, oh, so and so is a medium, our first image is a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still to this day, I mean, I think if you were to look, it was a book that came out in the 90s. And one of my very first interviews, Betty Lipton, was featured in that book, top 100 psychics in America. And I think about 90 of them are women.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big thing. And it was also a big, there was this big connection between spiritualists and a lot of the more progressive social movements of the time, uh, particularly feminism, the suffragette movement, and the abolitionist movement. It was a very When you talk about spiritualism in the 1800s, you're talking about lots of people who were all at the forefront of radical social change. So it was not merely a religious thing; it was also It was a social thing. I read a wonderful article that made a very good point, that by showing that there wasn't, because if you think about it at the time, you had life, and then the afterlife, and in the afterlife you go to heaven or you go to hell, and that's it. So you think about the eternal reward or the eternal punishment of those who do bad or good in life. Even today, people will say, "Oh, well, they'll get theirs in the end." Even if you escape earthly justice, you will have divine justice visited upon you. But if you are directly communicating with spirits and they're telling you, "No, that's not what it's like out here at all. In fact, it's very different." We go on and we evolve and have our own experiences in this vast eternity beyond the grave. Then there is no divine punishment for those who do evil on earth. So you got to do it now. You have to you have to do justice now. You can't just let people own slaves and enslave people and force them into a life of torture and servitude. You've got to stop it, because those people aren't going to go to hell to get punished. We got to stop it now. We got to do as much good as we can now. It changed. It was a totally different mindset, and it was a much more activist mindset. And so it was no wonder that spiritualism drew people like that.
So the spiritualism movement, um, eventually it reached a height, and then it started to die off, it started to crash.
There was certainly a decline, and part of that certainly has to do with uh, the skeptics that set up these investigations into what's really going on, and are these people telling us, is there any fraud going on? And what they found was rampant, constant fraud by hucksters and con artists, not sometimes not even playing very good tricks, sometimes very crude and obvious tricks, to convince people that they really were. And this is not to say that there aren't real spiritualists who really believe what they're doing is real. There were lots of them, and there still are. But among any fad, you're going to get the bad actors, and a lot of them were bad actors who said, "Wow, all I have to do is pretend to talk to the dead, and people are going to give me money. Sign me up." Uh, but as soon as you get investigated, people start going, "Hey, you put, for like the trumpet trick, you put a little chemical solution in the valve or whatever that produces bubbles that cause that causes the trumpet to start making sounds, and you time it to make sure that it happens when you ask the spirit to play the trumpet. um, hey, that you're saying that that's ectoplasm? That's a well, let me investigate that. Hey, hold on a second, that's not mystical substance, that's a bison liver, that, or this is a piece of an animal part. um, hey, this picture that you show me of a ghost that's behind these people, that's clearly a person in a mask. That is not what a ghost would look like. It just looks like a person in a pretty poorly made mask. You can even see the paint marks. It was constant. So there was something called the Sabert Commission, which happened. It was in the 1880s, and they investigated a number of spiritualist mediums, and they found that pretty much all of them were committing fraud. And when reports of how many hucksters and frauds there are in this movement were, written about and published, people could read them. That did make people kind of lose a little bit of their enthusiasm for it. Yeah, I mean, Harry Houdini was very famous for investigating claims of communication with the supernatural and proving it to be false, kind of like James Randi uh, did too, where he would expose charlatans and hoaxes, supernatural hoaxes.
Also gave birth to the modern day ghost hunter.
The modern day ghost hunter, yeah, and the modern day skeptic movement too.
Yeah, definitely. So it looks like it also helped further separate science from spirituality as well.
Well, surely, yeah. You're when you're talking about and that's one thing that insulates a lot of religion from criticism from science, is that you're talking about purely supernatural things. This stuff happened, you know, 6,000 years ago in the Middle East, or it happened in heaven, or it happened in before Earth was created. This is not stuff that science can investigate. These are claims of the supernatural. But as but spiritualism's strength was also its weakness. Its strength was, you don't have to just be told about the supernatural, you can experience the supernatural right now. That also opened it up to that also it was very vulnerable, because as soon as you say here's a physical claim for what I'm saying about the supernatural, that physical thing can instantly be investigated and shown to be true or false. So uh, so yeah, so it was the physical, it was the claims of directly experiencing the supernatural that ultimately um, lessened its popularity, because it just opened it up to criticism and investigation, and people could see for their, people could see for themselves, either, they could experience it, but they could also experience that it was false.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. The amount of which this movement now, I didn't really look at it as before, of people taking the power, putting something within their hands, or going forward on their own and investigating something. How hands-on the spiritualism movement became.
It was, yeah, very very hands-on, and yeah, and that's interesting, what you're saying about it showing, distinguishing and delineating science from the supernatural. Yeah, because if you put something within the realm of what science can understand, you're putting it at science's, beck and call. You're putting it at the mercy of science. Um, when you talk about miracles, obviously there are lots of people who still believe in miracles. The Catholic Church still officially believes that, teaches that miracles are a real thing, a real phenomenon. Um, but when you compare that to centuries and centuries ago, where miracles apparently were commonplace and people saw miracles all the time, thousands of years ago, as well, um, you obviously don't have as many claims of miracles nowadays. And that I would say is due to, the increasing prevalence of the scientific mindset. And if these spiritualists had tried this stuff in the 1200s, one, they would have all been burned as witches or
Yeah.
hanged. But two, they would have all been claimed to be actual supernatural occurrences. Uh, and people would have said, "Nope, I saw it with my own eyes. He really talked to a spirit, and that's why we need to hang him as a witch." Um, but now, in the age of science, that stuff could immediately be cut off at the knees and shown to be the fraud that it was. And it's hard to get past. I mean, you still have mediums. You still, there's TV show. There have been TV shows recently about mediums that communicate. Miss Cleo, was famous. Before she was also shown to be a fraud. Again, I don't know if you're noticing it.
There's also TV shows where people are claiming that Bigfoot is psychic.
Right, or that, that aliens came to visit them. Yeah, so these things are much more the fringe. These are fringe things. They're entertaining to watch, and I think that in an age before science, these claims, because they couldn't be properly investigated and people didn't have the mindset to think to investigate them in a certain way, they might be more prevalent. And I think that, that is partly the march of progress, the march of science is, you know because at the time, Presbyterians and, Methodists, they weren't making physical claims about Jesus coming to visit them in the night, to, give them revelations, and so a scientist couldn't come and see what's going on, and write down methodical observations. They were just saying, "Nope, this is what I believe in the Scripture, and I believe I have the feeling of God in me, and What are you going to do to disprove that? And you really can't. You can't disprove someone's feelings. Yeah, long way of saying yes. This was a very good example of providing science a supernatural thing to investigate and being able to show it to be a fraud.
Yeah, but it's all good reference material, people to at least visualize and understand.
Sure.
So is there anything else you want to tack on with the spiritualism movement, Philip?
Well, the spiritualism movement is still alive and well, and there are there's a big group in England that still practices it. There's a big several. I think there's a large organization in America. Um,
Many organizations in America. We are
many
the
organizations.
land of opportunity.
That's right. Yeah, you can invent your own religion even. And it has a lot of believers, and it has a lot of adherents, and elements of what it teaches. All the stuff we've talked about. This is not stuff that, when I guarantee you, everybody seances still get held nowadays, and people still, you know, my wife years ago had anxiety, and she would call a phone psychic, and this phone psychic would tell her, would communicate with her dead grandfather to tell her things were okay and everything. That goes back to exact this goes back to 1840. This goes back to the Fox sisters. This goes back to Emanuel Swedenborg. This technically goes back thousands of years to the early necromancers and the witch of Endor in the Bible. This idea that I need someone to talk to who can talk to this dead person. Napoleon Bonaparte, my dead father, my dead grandfather, my dead son who died in the war, because I need some reassurance now in this life. Just because I myself have said that, I've said hucksters and frauds and hoaxes, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a value and a use for people. And even though I don't believe in it, I don't think there's a harm in believing it. In fact, I think it actually helps a lot of people. The very principle is still attractive and is still popular enough to, keep a lot of mediums and psychics in business. And I think that, yeah, case in point, I think that it has a social function that means that it does have a use, even if I don't believe that it's supernaturally true.
I think it's a good way to close this interview out.
Yeah, yeah, nice. End it on a positive note.
End it on a positive note. So, regardless if you believe or don't believe, it still is fun to talk about.